Sister Carmela is not wearing a habit, but the substantial cross hanging on her blouse makes her religious affiliation clear. The class is called Body, Mind and Spirit. At this top-tier Catholic school, she feels comfortable confining herself to the third. She doesn't know many of the final year boys and girls by name, but she has a favourite, James, a shining example of what the Jesuits used to call muscular Christianity. He could well be destined for the priesthood, though he tells her that his father has other ideas. And lately he seems to have been struggling, not his usual self. Today he's not here. The boy sitting beside James's customary place to the front row shrugs in response to the unasked question. She's about to begin the lesson when, as one, the class looks to the doorway. James is standing with his hands raised and elbows at his sides in the priestly orans posture, his expression either beatific or stoned. He is completely naked. The class is, for a moment, stunned into silence. "James!" says Sister Carmela, in something between a whisper and a squawk. He lowers his hands, opens them, and when he speaks, it is with a serene authority beyond his years. "Ye shall know me no more as James. I am the Christ returned." One of the boys pulls off his jumper and walks towards James, offering it to him. "Hey, buddy." Up go the hands again, and the voice is now thunderous. "I am come to judge the living and the dead." Sister Carmela has had time to collect her thoughts after a fashion. "Gentle Jesus." It's a two-word prayer, but an unfortunate choice. "Would you like to speak to one of the well-being team?" "All heads shall bow, or ye shall surely burn in the fires of hell." A girl bows her head, slips out of her seat, and kneels on the floor. Her neighbour reaches for her, then changes her mind and drops to the floor beside her. Others begin to follow her lead. Sister Carmela watches, dumbstruck. Her eyes return to the tall boy surveying the class, promising to divide the saved from the sinners. Slowly, she sinks to her knees.
This one. Okay, we will explain that in due course. But first of all, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country to acknowledge that the lands and waters on which we're meeting of the Junjimara people of the Eastern Ma Nation, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to thank Jo and for putting this on and opening up on a day that she's not normally open. So, and to all of you for coming, which is fantastic in the middle of a bit of a chilly, wintry night. I'm Anne Buist. He's Graeme Simsion. A little explanation, we have cameramen here. I think Jo is actually filming this as well, but we have a documentary team here. If anyone doesn't want to be filmed, please let us know and we'll blot you out somewhere. We'll explain a little bit more about that and what we're doing. I'm going to hand over to Graeme. He is going to tell you a bit about the book tour and why we're doing it. I'm going to fill in what he forgets. Then I'm going to talk about the book. He's going to fill in what I forget. We'll talk a little bit about writing together because it's a bit unusual. We have done it before, but this book is very different. I'm going to read a little bit from the James chapter so you find out a bit more about what happens to James. And then we'll open up for questions. Yep.
Sounds good to me. And in typical married couple fashion, at any point, if I forget to say something, Anne will, of course, fill in the gap, and I will do the same if she does. So I'm here to talk about the book tour, and we are doing what we're calling the Great Australian Bookshop Tour. And it was motivated, people say, why are you doing this at a time when bookshop tours and book tours are seen as being a lot less successful and certainly a lot less economically viable than they used to be. And it's probably fair to say that we're not doing it for the money. In fact, any royalties from copies of The Glass House that we sell tonight will be given to charity. So we wanted to make it about something. It's not going to be a lot of money. We wanted to make it about something other than just promoting the book. But a big part of it was we wanted to acknowledge the tremendously important role that bricks and mortar, and particularly independent bookshops, have in our community. And for us as well. A few years back, I wrote a book called The Rosie Project, which I've mentioned, which became quite successful. In fact, it's one of the best-selling books best-selling Australian books, certainly in history. But what people often don't know is that it never made the Australian bestseller list. Because what it did do was it went to the top of the independent booksellers' bestseller list and stayed there for a couple of years. Because what happened with that book was that the independent booksellers in particular hand sold it. They read it, they liked it, they knew it was a little unusual and wouldn't necessarily be the first book that somebody would pick up if they were looking for a crime book or a romance or whatever it might be. And they said, hey, you give this book a bit of a try. And enough people gave it a bit of a try and passed it on that it became successful and enabled me in particular to have be a full-time writer. So I'm eternally grateful for what independent bookshops did. And we wanted to thank bookshops for that. The second reason is related. Our new book, The Glass House, which Anne's going to tell you a little bit about, is also a little unusual. It's certainly challenging. It's set in the mental health space, which is a challenging space to be in, and it pulls no punches. It's a very direct, honest book in an area where writers are told to be careful. We're not being careful here. Well, we're being careful in a different way. We're being authentic because we know what we're talking about, or at least Anne knows what we're talking about. And it's also structured differently from typical novels. It's an episodic structure, like your favourite TV series, I guess, or TV season. You know how it works. The long arcs of the main characters.
This is my talk.
Yeah, I know. This is where Anne gets to talk about the book, but I'm just setting the scene for you here, Anne. But it's an episodic structure rather than a standard novel structure. So it's a little bit challenging, and we felt this was a book that we needed to get out and hopefully encourage booksellers to do as they did with the Rosie Project, to become familiar with it, and encourage readers to have a look at it, explain what it was about, and perhaps sort of pass it on and recommend it to their friends. But what's really happened with the book tour is that we have discovered at every book event that we've met someone or reconnected with someone that we've known before, and we've discovered a sense of connection. Look, there was a lot of love when we did the Rosie Project book tour for that book. Let me tell you that this is a level above it on this tour, and I don't think it's because the book by itself is so much more meaningful than the Rosie Project, although a lot of people want to talk about mental health issues and so on. But I think there's a craving post-COVID for human connection. In this world where we have digital books, where we have digital dating, where we have digital friendships, fortunately not digital wine yet, but you know, there is some sort of craving out there to just really connect with physical books, physical people, physical champagne. So we've seen a lot of that on the tour, and we might share a couple of stories of things that have happened that have been uncanny sorts of connections as we've done it. But the question really was, where do we go? Which bookshops do we visit? Just the indies in Victoria, or what do we do? And way back in my previous life, I used to run a business consultancy, a business and IT consultancy. And we grew really rapidly to 6 people. And at about that size, Christmas came along, and we were running the business out of my apartment in the city, in Melbourne City, 2-bedroom apartment. And I invited a few clients to come over for drinks, pre-Christmas drinks. And it sort of got a little bit, I won't say quite out of hand, but we ended up with about 50 or 60 clients. And there was a band playing down on the street, and I got them to come up and join us. And, you know, it was a good night. And a year later, we had 2 bands, we had a couple of 100 people, and it was probably dangerous. So I said to our general manager, because I think we were 11 people at that point, I said to our general manager, I said, Huey, I want a venue that's in line with our ambitions. And a few days later, Huey came back and said, for next year, I booked the Maya Music Bowl. And he genuinely booked the Sydney Myer Music Bowl, one of the great venues of the world. And we got it a few days before Carols by Candlelight with all the decorations up, and we'd have crayfish and we would have 3 bands, and it became totally out of control over the years. And it was lucky I sold the business because it was getting to the stage where it was the hottest ticket in town pre-Christmas, and we had people saying, oh, why my subordinate got invited? Why didn't I get invited? And it was just all like that. So we said, okay, what are we going to do with this book tour? We said, every bookshop in Australia. We will visit every single bookshop, caveat, not secondhand bookshops, not Christian or Muslim or specialist design bookshops that wouldn't sell our book, but any bookshop that might stock our novel, The Glass House. We're going to go, and calls itself a bookshop. We're going to try to visit it, and we are number what?
I think about 175.
Okay, so Blarney Books is number 175 or so. And before I hand over to Anne, I want to tell you just one story, which just gives a sense, I guess, of the challenges that bookshops face. I mean, we're in a town where there are 2 independent bookshops. How tough is that? And my very first event with the Rosie Project was in a little country town, and the book hadn't sort of done anything at this point. We had 10 ladies of a certain age there in the local library, and the bookseller at the back, and I was full of energy for all this. I went to the bookseller and I said, big day today. And he said, looks at me like, you don't know how this works. So I gave my shtick about the Rosie Project. I talked about it and did my reading, and I could see that they were really engaged. I said, and if you want to know what happens next, you'll have to buy a copy from your local bookseller. And the librarian got up and she said, there's no need to do that. We've got copies in the library. And look, what a totally legitimate, reasonable thing to say. Sure. And what I said back at that point, I improvised, but I'll say it again tonight. I said, Christmas is coming. And Mother's Day even sooner, but you know what it's like when you think, what can I buy for that difficult nephew or whatever it might be? And you think, I am so glad that evening at Blarney Books, I bought this pile of signed copies of The Glass House, the hot book of the year, and I'm able to say, I was there, spoke to the author, there's a story behind this, and here's your signed copy, done, next. So, but you know what you have to do. Let me now pass over to Anne, because we've gone on this tour. It's not the Great Australian Book Tour, it's the Great Australian Book Shop Tour. But it seemed like a good idea to time it with the release of our latest book, and so we'd have something to talk about. And we indeed have a book to talk about, and Anne's going to do exactly that.
Okay. Oh, I think you did pretty well, apart from just kind of, we're going as far north as Darwin, Port Douglas. We couldn't fit Broome in. We're driving to Perth at the moment, but didn't have time to get up to Broome, so we're going to have to fly there at the end. It's going to be our very last one, but mostly driving all over the place. Had a few excitements with the car. The bumper bar fell off, but we'll get there. We'll get there. So the book. So we've both been writing for a while, and obviously I have a mental health background, so I've been working in psychiatry for 35 or more years, and has fed into the crime thrillers that I write, but that's very much background. But all through this time I've been coming home and saying to Graeme, you'll never believe what happened today. And that might be any number of things, including quite frequently about management. And because he's an ex-manager, it was often, I can't believe this. Why are they doing this? But lots of interesting stories. And of course, Graeme and we all have lots of interesting mental health stories.
Anne won't brag here, but the thing is, we've all got mental health stories of ourselves, of our family, of our friends, and so forth. Some of them might be even more dramatic than the ones that Anne has, although I doubt it. But the difference is, it's like I come to you and say, oh, I lost my wallet in Barcelona. You say, well, that's interesting, Graeme. Versus you talk to a detective who works in Barcelona, and he says, Graeme, I'm guessing what happened was this. Some guy approached you and asked for the time, and at the same time, a guy came up and, Yeah, wow, that is actually exactly what happened. That's how they do the scam. And this is how we catch them. And suddenly you've got insight to the context and of what's going on, of how it fits in, of what people are doing about it. And that's what Anne does to the mental health stories, even to the ones that I bring home rather than her.
I think Graeme likes to think that the book will make you smarter. And I think that's... Smarter. Yeah, and I think that's probably true, but that's not what we set out to do. But I guess in the back of my mind there was definitely stories to be told, and particularly after COVID, I felt that there was a sort of an awareness, because we were talking about 6-year-olds and the problems they were having starting school or not being able to start school because of COVID, and the VCE students who were not being able to go to uni because of COVID, that they were having these high rates of anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, that suddenly it was actually kids and normal people having mental health issues. And I think it just made us a little bit more open to the idea of talking about mental health, or at least that's my theory. So that's kind of been going on in the background, as well as what I saw the Rosie Project do for the autistic community. It really was part, I think, of the wave of helping neurodivergence be accepted, along with Big Bang Theory and other things as well. But the autistic community really adopted Don Tillman around the world, that he was a hero and he was okay, and it was okay to be different. And I thought, how wonderful would it be able to do that for mental health in a book? And I'm not sure that we've done that for this book, but I think that's the space that it's in. And what we've found is that there is nothing else in this space. So as Graeme's intimated, it's a bit like a season of House. So think of House or Grey's Anatomy, only it's set in an acute psych ward. And the Grey's Anatomy is the emotional arc, and instead of House, you get Hannah Wright, who's a 27-year-old psychiatry registrar trying to get into the psychiatry training program to be a psychiatrist, and Professor Gordon doesn't think she's ready. So we have an antagonist right from the beginning, but we're learning with Hannah and through her eyes. And there are basically 13 chapters, which are also 13 episodes of what you would see in a TV season. And it's very familiar. You won't have any problems making sense of this, how it's shaped. While you get a patient per week, you also get 3 patients going through the entire course of the book. And the little blurb that you heard Graeme read is the scene setter at the beginning of every chapter. Just like you would see on a TV series, you'd see a scene from probably later in the episode. You get that from the patient perspective, but then you go into Hannah's eyes, and you follow it from where she's seeing it. And of course, I've been a 27-year-old psych registrar hardly any time ago. So it was easy to kind of get into that space to be able to kind of inhabit this world. And it's a pretty fascinating world. It's not as scary. It's not as worrying. I think the more you understand it, the less frightening it is, and the more we can make changes. And just like they've done, I think, reasonably well in the media with the Bondi Junction thing, is they've avoided saying mental illness equals violence. It's about homelessness. It's about not getting medication. It's not having available psychiatrists. It's way more complicated. And that's what we've tried to put in this book. And with a bit of a light touch, because, we don't want to preach. It's a page turner. We want you to keep, wow, what's going to happen next? And Graeme's, that there's humour in it as well. I mean, I think all life has ups and downs, and humour. Mental illness is episodic. You don't just get a mental illness and suddenly, you're locked away forever. I mean, occasionally that happens, but very, very uncommon. You get better, you go home. Just like if you've got cancer, you might go into remission for a while, but then you need another treatment. You might need another admission. So it's that kind of, the complexity and the variation is what we've tried to show. The 3 patients that we follow are, we follow someone with postpartum psychosis. Most of my clinical work is with perinatal psychiatry, and that's able to show the whole effect on the family, the baby, the husband, the grandparents and where they all play a part. We've got someone with a severe anorexia nervosa and the family implications in both directions of her illness to them and them to her. And then the third one is a politician who makes a suicide attempt. So we get to see them in more depth, but you see a variety of other patients as you would in a normal situation of working in an acute psychiatry ward. And I'm sure I've forgotten something there.
No. That's pretty right. But you were going to talk about how we wrote it. That was the why we wrote it and where the idea came from. But the third question is, so how did you go about writing, and what's it like writing with him?
Well, we can both talk to this because it involved both of us. So I know there's a couple of copies there of 2 Steps Forward and 2 Steps Onward, which is kind of where we came to. Well, Graeme was already studying screenwriting at this time. We walked the Camino in 2011. But when we were walking the Camino in 2011, that was kind of when I started to really think about trying to go back to being a writer, which is what I'd always wanted to be since I was, very young. And I'd had a book at the last phase at Random House in my 30s, but then academe intervened and I got $4 million to run the Beyond Blue program. So I did that for the next 10 or so years. But I was a bit burnt out in 2011 so we walked the Camino and along the way decided we'd really like to write a book set on the Camino. And so the long and the short of that was we did, but it was relatively, after planning it together, we just did alternating chapters. He was the bitter divorcee, I was the flaky widow, we hated each other, and then of course we fell in love. So that was kind of pretty simple to do. This was much harder to do because it's my world. Even getting Graeme to write the chapter, even if we'd planned it out, like the first chapter is a woman gets admitted after she's been wielding a knife. Graeme has no idea how that happens. He does now, but even then there's so much complexities in when the CAT team comes, when the police come, who brings you into the ward, who collects the paperwork. Not that everything is all written down on the page like that, but just the practicalities. It's my world. So having planned it out, I went into a complete kind of feverish sort of crazy sort of I had 2 weeks off and I just basically wrote the whole thing bar 2 chapters in about 10 days. It was 7,000 words a day. As Graeme pointed out when he read it, is you seem to be missing some words here, though he wasn't quite so polite when he said that. And there was other times he said, what on earth do you mean? And I'd read it and it made perfect good sense to me. And I said, well, what do you mean? It's good English. The grammar's okay. It might not be perfect, but... And he said, no, you don't understand. No one is going to understand this. And I guess there were things I was assuming people knew that they don't. So
I got a book over there which is called The Novel Project, which explains that how to write a novel. And it says, if you skimp at one stage, you'll pay for it in the next. And let's just say that Anne wrote this first draft at 7,000 words a day. She wrote the entire thing in about 12 days, except for chapter 13. Actually, I did actually write one chapter because of an autistic character and so on, but put that aside, she's got 12 chapters down at 7,000 words a day. I have to say I was impressed just with that volume, not necessarily with the quality, but the volume was definitely there. And look, and the guts was down on the page. I mean, the patient comes in there, they get moved there, they get to there. It's all there, which was, as you said, the procedural stuff that you needed. But I had something to prove. So I said, chapter 13 is really about the consequences of all this. It's more about human relationships and about medical procedures and so on. Give it to me. So I got up one morning, 6:30 a.m., coffee, and I went at it all day, only stopping for essential bodily functions, meaning more coffee, and just kept rolling it. At the end of the day, it would have been 8:30 at night. I worked flat out for maybe 14 hours. I said, bang, done, Anne. And she looked at me and said, it's only 3,000 words, Graeme. So even at my best, I'm only half that productive, but keep going.
And as Graeme has basically said, that you pay for doing it rapidly. We then had 29 complete passes through this manuscript, because originally, even though we had Hannah's background kind of worked out, so I wasn't writing me, but ultimately there was a lot of me in Hannah version 1, because I had been a 27-year-old, psych registrar, and we had to millennialise her, and I supervise current registrars, so I'm very aware of the current programs. So that was already in place. But their relationships with each other, a lot of work on that, a lot of work on the story arcs within each chapter. Just lots of extra work, really.
Toughest stage was the planning. Well, I didn't do the draft, so I can, that's Anne can make her own comments on that. But the toughest stage, it took us about 1.5 years to get the way of telling the story, because we wanted to tell it from the mental health worker's perspective, which, by the way, some publishers will tell you it shouldn't be done. Everything is supposed to be written from the point of view of the patient, as it were, of lived experience. And, well, as Hachette said, Anne has lived experience as a mental health worker. But this idea that only the person who's got the illness can tell the story, from my point of view, as an ex-management consultant, if you tell one side of the story, it's very good for fueling anger. But if you want to actually affect any change, you need to hear where everybody is coming from, because you're going to have to change all of those people. But we wanted to tell it from the point of view, rightly or wrongly, warts and all, with all their mistakes and everything, from the point of view of the health workers. But we also wanted to take a deep dive into the various patients who came in their various cases. And 12, 13 cases, that would be a lot of strands. You would just get totally lost in a conventional novel. You'd have to keep case notes. It'd be like reading Game of Thrones, only worse, with more storylines. And we stumbled really upon the fact that, because I'm a screenwriter, I guess, by background, that way of storytelling has been done forever in TV series. It's since Dr. Finlay's case books, and since Perry Mason, whatever, that you have the ongoing characters, and each episode you investigate one particular group of people who come into that episode and they disappear at the end of that. They might pop up again later, but essentially you concentrate on that. I've got to tell you, publishers, including our original publisher, were not comfortable with that. They said, that's not the way you do a book. I thought, well, it's a storytelling mode. It's a mode that people are very, very familiar with from television. They'll get it. And as it's turned out, nobody's really come to say, oh, couldn't follow that episodic structure. I was like, yeah, I get it. So there we go. But that was the hardest job, was deciding how we'd structure the book and then whose story it would be to tell. And we looked at lots of options, but settled on, let's do the journey with the trainee. Let's watch her as she learns. Let's learn with her, rather than gaze in amazement at Gregory House, who knows way more than the average doctor. We're all starting. Most of us are starting at a pretty low base with mental health.
And there was something else I was going to say, and I've forgotten. So, yeah, I think you've covered. No, there was something else.
There's bound to be something really important that we forgot to say, but it'll come out in question time, so it'll be great. So what I'll do now is I'll introduce Anne to read the second part of the book. So from the same chapter where our young man has appeared naked to his pals in class, now what has happened in the chapter, this actually came from real life for me. But Anne offered all the interpretations and the background and the experience. But one of my colleagues' daughter had an episode of psychosis, and he encountered the mental health system, and it was pretty scary, and Anne helped him navigate through it. But he was a manager, and he was like, what are the results I get at each stage? Am I talking to competent people? What are my expectations? And discovered this sort of very different culture in medicine, which was more like, trust me, we know what we're doing, we'll see what happens. And he says, no, this is my daughter. So we have thrown in Michael, who's the young man in front of the class. His father is not too happy with the way he's being treated. He's now sought 2 or 3 opinions. He's spoken to our friend Hannah, to our protagonist, but he's now gone off to see the professor, and he's just come back from seeing the professor.
And the other person you need to know is that Nash Sharma is the psychiatrist in charge of the acute ward. Your professor's a wanker. Michael announces in the middle of the glasshouse to kick off conversation. I manage to suppress a smile. Then he adds, as you'd expect, given he's an academic, but he seems to know what he's talking about, and he knows how to communicate with people on the same level. Wanker to wanker, I just nod. And he emphasised if it's a psychosis, then it's physical, biological basis. Your boss, Nash, threw me when he said it didn't have an organic basis. It made it sound like it was caused by something at home. Anyway, it's an illness like any other, and we throw the drugs at it and get it sorted. What I want you to tell me is, what is his prognosis? I have no idea what the prof said to him. My attempt to keep my responses vague, they hear what they want to hear when they're ready, doesn't satisfy Michael. He makes it obvious that he thinks I don't know the answer. Joy, his wife, all but rolls her eyes. At him or at me? Screw it. They're asking for the truth. They can have it. Carey, the research assistant, may not have persuaded Nash, but if James was my child, I'd want to know. If I was James, I'd want my parents to know. About 1/3 of people who experience a psychotic episode recover completely and return to their lives. And the other 2/3? Another third have a few episodes over their lives but do okay, and a third have a more chronic course with ongoing problems. Well, we'll make damn sure he never smokes another joint if those are the consequences. That's part of the answer, but he may relapse anyway, and if he does, he almost certainly has schizophrenia. Michael and Joy both flinch, then look at each other. I'm guessing Prof didn't use that word. Go on, Michael says. It's a tough disease, maybe what your mother had. According to James, Michael never visited his mother. What does that mean for his son? We have better treatment options now, though. As a family, what you can do is to reduce the chances of less happy outcomes is get on board with the treatment, find a good psychiatrist, work with them, ask questions and listen to the answers. If things don't go as we hope, then family support is going to make a huge difference to James' quality of life. Thanks for telling us, says Joy. It's better to know. Nash walks in, then takes a step back, seeing we're in conversation, but Michael's attention switches immediately to him. I've seen Professor Gordon and I've told Dr. Wright he was straightforward and helpful. At this stage, I just want to ask you 2 questions. His first question is about diagnosis, the second prognosis. Nash tells him exactly what I did. Michael nods. A father's been told that there's 1 in 3 chance his 17-year-old son has chronic schizophrenia, and I feel like punching the air. I begin to mentally chastise myself, and Michael finishes the job. All right, I've spoken to 5 qualified people now, and 4 of them have told me the same thing, and I expect the only reason that the consultant and ED didn't was to avoid a confrontation. I'm used to that. I'm also used to taking advice from people who know what they're doing, but we're talking about my son here. Our son, says Joy. You get many patients thinking they're Jesus Christ, says Michael. It's the sort of thing you make jokes about without thinking about the reality. Not so much these days, says Nash. More likely to be big pharma or microchips, whatever's in the patient's head. Michael looks at his wife. Joy here has made James go to church ever since he was born. I've got no time for it, and no, says Nash, if you need to build a house and you've got straw, you make it out of straw. If you've got sticks or bricks. Weirdly, Michael laughs. Everyone in his class has to have counselling, overseeing a naked kid, even the boys. Plenty of work for you guys. But the teacher, actually she's a nun, went down on her knees. Afterwards, she said she was just playing along to appease James. But I think she thought the rapture had come. So that was a bit of a long reading, but it gives you a bit of an idea of sort of, it's not all quite as serious as that, with light touch. We're going to open for questions, but the other thing that I remembered that I didn't talk about before, because I remember before, but I didn't want to interrupt before, is that part of, Graeme said right at the beginning that we were going to go in, and do this, not following guidelines that writers get given because I kind of, I come from this world. But we didn't want to harm anyone. We wanted to make sure that this was authentic, but that it was going to be that it wasn't going to be harmful or hurtful. So every chapter went past a clinical expert in the field. Yes, I'm pretty sure I knew everything. There was a couple of, actually the funniest one was, I got the psych case right, but the professor who read it said, you realised you left that woman sitting frozen in her chair for 3 days and you don't give her any IV fluids when she gets to hospital. So I thought, oh, okay. So they went past, but we also put it past sensitivity readers, people with lived experience, including a non-binary autistic character, because one of the characters, the research assistant, is non-binary autistic. So we got a lot of input and a lot of really good feedback. And the non-binary autistic person also had multiple admissions to hospital with schizophrenia. So they really knew what they were referring to and gave great feedback.
So okay. Credit where credit's due. It was Yen Purkis, who is an activist particularly in the autism community, and who very graciously provided a quote for the back cover and interviewed us in Canberra. So it's really nice to have people in that community on board. I'm here to say we had our opening reader when we launched the book at Readings in Carlton, was Heidi Everett, who is the chair of Schizzy Inc. She's which supports people with mental illness in the arts, and they're the recipients of our charitable donations, our royalties from the books sold here. But she did a great reading, but afterwards she said, look, I liked your book, it's well written and so on, but you're very kind to the mental health workers. It's certainly not the way that I saw them, and it's certainly not the way they're portrayed in her book My Friend Fox, and absolutely fairly so, because that's her perspective on the world. I just think it's really important that we have hers on the page, and I would say read The Glass House, read My Friend Fox, see it from both sides.
And he's made sure the manager isn't evil. I actually don't mind my managers. It's just they give me all this paperwork to do, which keeps me away from my patients, and it's the eternal kind of curse of clinicians. So everyone has motivations that make sense.
So that's a really dull note to go out on, So let me tell one story to finish, okay?
And then questions.
Okay.
I hope you're thinking questions.
Look, I think one of the uncanny things about this book has been the level to which, if you write authentically, if you write authentically, you find that life does imitate art, that you've written something authentic, it's come from life, and then you go and look at life again and you see things that are in the book appearing there. But at our very early event in Terrelgan, we had an opening reader, because we often have an aspiring writer, give them the opportunity to speak to a larger audience, come and just do a short reading to start off. And our reader was Abbas Merin, an Iranian man, who was writing a novel to really complete the work that his daughter, Marsha Merin, who wrote Pomegranate Soup, wrote. And in Abbas's words, she, after a battle with writer's block, which led to mental health issues, she lost her life. Right, a story out there. Chapter 5 of our book is about an Iranian woman with writer's block, which is a little bit freaky when you think about it. And we talked to him about it. And look, in the chapter, in fact, Hannah, our protagonist, says, here I am in the acute psych ward, and we've got people who are on the verge of suicide. We've got people who are possibly going to lose their life through eating disorders. We've got people with serious chronic depression, the 17-year-old boy with psychosis, and she's got writer's block. Poor her. And then she pulls herself up and realizes, this is what early intervention is about. This is about doing something before it goes down the sort of path that Abbas related about his daughter. So, it's been, I imagine there are people in the audience here tonight who will read the book and say, oh my God, that is exactly or close enough to what happened with my brother-in-law or whatever. And let me say, there's a lot of good news stories in there as well. They're not all bad news stories. So, can we... We can have questions now. I just want to tell another story, that's all. Questions? At the back of the room. What a lovely question. Would we like to see it turned into a TV series? We would like to see it turned into a good TV series. And so we spent some time looking for a producer, because pretty obviously TV producers looked at this book and thought, well, it's all done. It's all there in the format that we need. Whereas normally books are not written that way. They're written more like a feature film in terms of shape. Whereas you've got producers looking for TV content now, which is a whole other thing, because you've got to make it episodic. We wanted a producer who was as excited about the book as Hachette, about the TV possibilities, as Hachette have been about the book. And did we find one? Let's just say we are contractually obliged not to talk about that subject.
I think there's another couple at the back. There was, okay. We've had such a long course with this book. I'm pretty sure it was about the time we changed publishers that we gave. I think Yen read the whole book. Yeah.
It was after the structural edit, after we had the feedback from our structural editor, but before the copy edit. So while we were still in the position to make significant change. We didn't need to. There were a few things. Well, one thing was the title. Our publisher wanted to call it The Fish Tank. And interestingly, some of our sensitivity readers who had lived experience in those sorts of places, in fact, Yen, who had spent time in exactly this environment, was comfortable with it. They said, we see it as a fish tank where we're looking at the practitioners, the clinicians in the fish tank. But it was actually a couple of sensitivity readers who had inpatient experience, but not in an acute ward, and therefore didn't have that explicit experience, who found it offensive in the sense that it would be, we're looking at these weird animals, these creatures in a fish tank, these exotic, we're being voyeurs, as it were. So we changed it to Glass House for that reason. So there was so title's a fairly big change. And look, it was mainly detail. We didn't have anybody come back and say, look, this is just totally offensive, this is all wrong, or anything like that.
We've had someone since say they can't forgive Hannah for how she has a bit of a kind of a brain dump about sort of how she feels about a particular patient, because I thought it was important, because that happens. I mean, it's people are human in the middle of the night or whatever, and certain patients get under your skin or whatever. But we have one of the other doctors immediately take her up on it and say, hold on, do you want to be her, etc. So we didn't change that because I thought it was there, and hopefully most people forgive her for being human, and she feels embarrassed and ashamed of herself.
When I was a business consultant, we used to use the analogy of the kitchen and the living room. You've got guests for a formal dinner, things are going wrong in the kitchen, you're shouting at each other. You go out and as the late Robert Carrier said, you present it as a triumph, no matter what has happened. So you've got the kitchen where you sort out your own problems amongst yourselves, but in terms of dealing with the patient or the customer or whatever, you present a united, friendly, consistent sort of front. And in this book, we take you into the kitchen, and that's not a nice place to be, watching sausage being made.
Yeah, another right back. Look, I totally agree. Think the complexity of mental illness is vast, and every individual is different, which is what's kept me fascinated by this. When I get called out in the middle of the night and you think, why am I doing this? 30 seconds with a patient, I'm hooked. I'm in their world and wanting to help them and support them and promote. But everyone has a different view of how they perceive their illness, and I don't think we're very good at working with that, largely because we're under-resourced and just don't have time. So it takes roughly about 3 weeks for an antipsychotic to kick in. The length of stay is around 11 days in the acute ward. So do the math. We just don't have that space. Now, lucky people with a good private psychiatrist or a really good team might get all of the in-depth of what they need. But I think in particular of something that Heidi Everett said, the writer of My Friend Fox, about community treatment orders, which is a very mundane kind of thing. It's about treatment, not about the concept of mental illness. So sorry, I'm digressing slightly. But to me, a treatment order is I'm wanting to keep the patient well, and if it's really, I don't think they're going to stay with treatment and they're a danger themselves or others, they tend to go on a community treatment order. Now, the reality is I do this very rarely because I work in perinatal, so it's not something I'm doing very often. But in acute psychiatry, it's very common. And to me, that's part of the treatment plan. Not to Heidi Everett, it's not. To someone with schizophrenia who's presumably endured these treatments, it's an absolute robbing of dignity. And I think it's really important to be reminded of that in when we conceptualise what's happened to someone, their experience in acute ward, which can be terrifying. If you're a 17-year-old girl being admitted for the first time to an acute psych ward, it would be, as a mother, I would be terrified for my daughter because there are a lot of very aggressive, sexually kind of acting out young men. But that we only get them, I'll get to you in a minute, we only get them in the acute ward, which is where this book is, for a very short period of time. A lot of what you're describing needs to work with the therapist in the talking therapy in the next year to 2 years. I suspect not many people get it, but that's what I'd be looking for to make sense for myself of what my illness meant for me and within the world in which we live.
I think Anne's given an answer which is very much in keeping with what's in the book, which is essentially a clinical perspective with a major attempt at being empathetic to the patient's experience. But I think the question that you've asked is bigger. I think the question you've asked is a philosophical question at many levels. It's about the nature of what we choose to call mental illness, about the ways that we then approach it. When mental illness is the broadest sense is a difference. And when someone is different in some way, how do we classify that difference? How do we approach that difference? And I come from my own model here is watching the autism community, where autism has gone from being seen as something which is absolutely an illness. It's still called a disorder, ASD. Even the the activists are still calling it often autism spectrum disorder, to being a deficit, to being a fault, to being something wrong, towards being something that we see has strengths and weaknesses, to say, look, it's just a difference. And then you say, well, that's our diagnostic path that we've gone down with autism, but then you have to go down, I say, treatment, meaning a path of response. How do we respond to that? Do we try to change the person so they fit society better? Do we try to change the society? What are the limits of that? And equally, there's a question: if a drug could fix anorexia nervosa, if a drug could fix writer's block, is the question we ask in the book. If a drug could fix writer's block, would our patient take it? And she makes it quite clear she damn well would. But what would that mean? And a big part of the book is what Anne calls, what others call the battle for the soul of psychiatry, where the two camps are one which is a talking therapy camp that goes back to Freud and so forth, and which has largely been picked up by the psychologists now, and the other which is a medical model, which is, if this part of the brain lights up, this is on the MRI, then this is the drug that we're going to give. So I think he asked a really huge question, and I think it's probably fair to say that the answer we give in the book contributes to that, but doesn't take it nearly as broad as you've asked it. Is that okay? Look, I think in the autism space we're better. Okay, I think, and when we go back to sort of romantic idea of the village culture, where even the village idiot fitted in and everybody had a role and that sort of thing, and maybe that did exist, but that's a long way back. Or at least it's a long way back for Port Fairy and for Victoria and so forth. There may well be societies, there probably are societies where that sort of model still sits. But I think if we go back just to the 50s or so, I don't think you find a lot of tolerance. I think you find a lot of discrimination. And I certainly grew up in the 60s and 70s in a world where the job was to mould the boy into being a fit member of society. And you had to be good at, and I have, you probably hear it in my voice, I have a massive resentment about this, about being moulded to be something I wasn't, because that was the criteria you're supposed to fit. And that included being able to hit a ball in a certain way and do all sorts of things which had no real practical value except saying you conformed. And I think it's easier than it was, and it's easier for our kids in many ways than it was in that area, but it raises its own thing that once you throw all the options at the kids and say, well, you can be whatever gender you feel you are and that sort of thing, these are not simple, we accept you. They become challenges. They become things for kids to think about as well. So I think I don't know if we made it easier, but I think we are more accepting.
I think it's more complicated than that. I think it's very complicated. Yeah, and if you look at sort of the anxieties in our current children, like under 18-year-olds, they're way worse. They may be more accepting in many ways, but it's created other problems, and social media just throwing in on top of that has been a huge issue. So, yeah, and if you look at America, and hopefully we don't go down America's thing, but the whole tribalism, it has been, if you kind of excluded for whatever reasons or feel excluded economically because of your skin colour, whatever it is, then you kind of you look for your tribe, and social media and the trolling and everything can kind of go into that. So it's very complicated, and I think there's lots of problems currently in that area.
Yeah, and the rigidity. I would say that publishers who said we won't publish this book because mental health stories can only be told from the patient's point of view. The publisher who rejected the Rosie result because Don makes a very serious faux pas directly as a result of his autism, and well, that faux pas was at it was a more serious level than what we're prepared to forgive in autism. This is about intolerance. And I think that the tribalism is part of it, and I think there's a rigidity about morals, which is almost religious, just translated into a secular context. And I think we could all loosen up a bit. But look, on that note, and look, the saying to know all is to understand all is to forgive all is a big statement. But we hope that the book, as with the Rosie Project series, sort of takes readers a bit down that path to having a better understanding of what's going on, which hopefully informs a more tolerant and accepting view. One more question, because then we'll wrap it and sign some books, and you can, as we're doing that, you're more than welcome while you're buying your Christmas presents to talk to us about topics. I'll let Anne take the final answer, but Okay, well, look, just I want to add a little bit and then and finish it off. But the who cares for the carer thing is another example of this rigidity of thought, which I think that it must be one thing or the other. And again, in the autism community, which is the one that I don't identify as autistic, but I consider myself an ally of that community. But in that community, there is a real anger towards carers, and so amongst some of the activists, that why do they get to complain, as it were, rather than the autistic person? They're making it about themselves rather than the autistic person. And I would say it is about them, just as it is about the autistic person. That families and friends and people are impacted by others, and that's the nature of a society. And it is important to hear the struggles of someone caring for an autistic person, just as long as we don't do that at the expense of hearing the story of the autistic person directly. If someone records that and plays that back, I'll probably be in trouble on social media for saying that.
And I dealt with my my burnout by going part-time back in 2011. So I haven't, and I still work in psychiatry, and I still love it, and I'm still passionate about it. And I actually did go off the on-call roster about 6 months ago. I finally decided I don't need to do this anymore. So I haven't felt, so I didn't write the book for therapy at all. It was really altruistic. I mean, also I'm a writer and I love writing, so I feel compelled to write. But there was a very kind of a hopeful bulb of altruism in there as well. And because I'm passionate about my patients, I hoped I could bring that passion and love for them to the page.
So guys, time's up. As I said, thank you so much. You've been a really great audience. And look, and what a wonderful space. Joe and Dean, thank you so much for this space. Long may you prosper.